Uh-oh, I'm criticizing ContraPoints.
This is Orwell's nightmare.
And it's kind of weird because I made trans horror for October, my big, magnum opus video essay. And then all of the big bread tubers, all the big lefty YouTubers kind of made videos about the same exact topics of trans bathroom panics and TERFs and J.K. Rowling and all of that stuff. So it kind of leads me to believe that they saw my video or something, or there was some kind of collective consciousness movement that just caused us all to focus on this same thing at the same time. But now I'm back to make sort of maybe a sequel to my video, because ContraPoints' last video, J.K. Rowling, I found to be lacking in a couple of incredibly critical areas, but I don't have any other big criticisms of the video or her or anything, and I'm not a ContraPoints hater. I've spent more time, infinitely more time defending her than hating on her. So it's kind of if you're here just to circle jerk in a shit fest on someone, that's kind of not the point of my video. So I'm just going to get straight into it now. I don't want to spend a lot of time meandering through an introduction. So let's just cut straight to where the problems lie.
No trans person thinks it's possible to change chromosomal sex, and to pretend otherwise is to argue in bad faith. When we say that someone is a trans man or a trans woman, we're talking about psychological and social identity. So when transphobes say sex is real, they're not actually contradicting anything most trans people believe, except by implication. When transphobes say sex is real, what they mean is only chromosomal sex matters. They mean they don't believe in transgender identity, which they trivialize, calling it dressing up, fashion choices, whatever you want to call yourself.
The root of the problem is the categorization of bodies into two supposedly discrete, disparate camps, male and female, which correlate with man and woman, genders as they are sort of societally enforced today in our culture. Here is where the TERFs' conflation of sex and gender also lies, which is a conflation that is another feature of gender as a social structure as it is enforced and maintained culturally in our culture today. It is as if bodies are inscripted with labels according to biological features. And for the transphobes, even if what the inscription carries for a given individual, all of the popular associations with the term male, for example, all the interests, traits, appearances, presumed sexual interests, and physiognomic features that are culturally lumped into the label are nothing more than a painful, crushing weight upon that individual. You're still expected to wear it, or else they deem you as a monster. And even if you erase the inscription of male and reinscribe yourself, following whatever interests and appearances come naturally for you, or even conforming to the expectations and associations that are expected in those inscribed as female, the transphobe's eyes still see that old inscription. They impose it upon you again, over and over again. It's their mistake, and ultimately the mistake of our culture, but they never want us to escape it. They themselves have not escaped the mistaken conception of gender itself, which reigns high in our culture still, as it's only slowly being eroded by advancements towards LGBT equality and all of that. The perception that premises itself upon this traditionalistic conception of gender produces a lot of misconceptions about us when they see us. You like wearing women's clothes, but you're a male, so therefore this must just be some kind of sexual fetish for you or something. You like wearing makeup, so you must just see femininity and womanhood as a sexualized performance. You call yourself a woman, but you're a male, so therefore you must have some kind of understanding of womanhood that's only from outside of it, modeling yourself as after this kind of representative model. All of their misconceptions are premised upon their view of us as male, that inscription, and their view of sex more broadly as a rigid binary of two discrete experiences of the world that never intersect or intermingle. Of course, all of this is nonsense. It doesn't matter if a trans woman fulfills all of the qualifications to fit into the sexual category of male. That doesn't inherently necessitate anything about their identity or their experience of themselves and their experience within their own body or their social cultural being in the world. Trans women aren't basing themselves off of this external representation of femininity that comes from vagina magic or some shit. Femininity is the same cultural force for everyone, and how it affects them is obviously mediated by their individual affinity with that force. Also, biological sexual categories are still ultimately categories invented by humans. Just because they refer to physically observable substances doesn't mean that the entire world is reducible down to our current cultural understandings of physical substances. These categories are never and will never be objective in the final sense, true even if divorced from all human perception. Because like all categories, they were produced only from within malleable human perception. If things had turned out differently, the labels male and female would have been flipped from what they currently mean in our timeline. They are not set in stone, and like all things, they're subject to the infinitely flowing sands of time and culture.
When Joanne says sex is real, she sounds like she's staking out a position in the trans debate, which is then presented as an intellectual conflict about the metaphysics of gender, instead of what it really is, which is a political conflict about the social equality of transgender people. And the effectiveness of that strategy is actually a reason I'm not a huge fan of the slogan, "trans women are women," because it tends to invite the response, well, what does it even mean to be a woman? Define womanhood. And now you're immediately getting baited into some bullshit semantic debate about what is a real woman. A real woman. How do you know you're a real woman, Amber? What if you're in the Matrix right now, and in the real world, you're biologically male? The tables are turned. It doesn't really matter, does it?
Of course it matters. The entire problem is that transphobes don't view us as women. We will not achieve trans liberation until the statement "trans women are women" is common sense. Until so-called male bodies can be looked at by your average person who will then say, that is a woman, if they are a trans woman. That isn't the world that we live in today. And that is exactly the problem that Natalie's video neglects.
This is metaphysics, and life is too short for metaphysics.
Life is not too short for metaphysics.
What we share are a common set of political struggles against discrimination, against harassment, against excessive medical gatekeeping, against exclusion from public life. So what would be a better slogan than "trans women are women"? Well, ideally, something that includes all trans people and something that evades pointless philosophizing about biology and what is gender and who is true trans and what is a woman really. Something that centers what actually matters, which is freeing trans people from the stigma and discrimination that have historically prevented us from becoming equal members of society.
But what matters even more is freeing trans people from the transphobic misperceptions of us which suppress and oppress us in the social field, like the belief that trans women are men. Imagine a world where discrimination against trans people is illegal and everyone has easy access to transitioning, but your average person still thinks that having a penis makes you a man and trans people are just deranged or confused. I wouldn't call that a world where trans liberation has been achieved. Far from it. And while I am a materialist philosophically, so I don't necessarily think that politics is downstream from culture, I can't see the first part of that world being achieved until the last part of that world is erased.
I feel like trans culture is just so obsessed with reassuring ourselves that we are valid that we sometimes forget that the end goal of a political movement is not validity, it's equality.
Equality includes validity for trans people because cis people never have to deal with being misgendered and having their entire gender identities being misinterpreted and suppressed by society. The social equality of transgender people doesn't end in the legal and medical domains. Social equality of transgender people includes how we are perceived and conceived and how we exist within the social realm itself. Which means social equality for trans people can only really fully be achieved once we win the so-called ideological battle in addition to all of our fights against inequality in the legal and medical domains. People don't misgender others because discrimination against trans people is illegal in large parts of the country. They misgender us and perceive us in bigoted ways because of the currently hegemonic yet outdated conception of gender itself that exists today. So we can't just throw up our hands and cede the conceptual ground entirely as if the way people view us doesn't matter, when literally the way that they view us is a huge part of the whole problem. Transphobia cannot be reduced to the individual traumas of the transphobic people themselves as its cause. The issue is our society and its concepts. So, since we cannot afford to neglect the conceptual, philosophical, metaphysical, ideological domain in our battle for trans liberation, then we must do a little bit of philosophizing. We do a little philosophizing. If we want to take the state philosophy route, as all social democrats inevitably do, we will say, I am a trans woman. I qualify to fit into the territory of trans woman. And here are my qualifications. Here's my diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Here's my long hair and silky voice. Here are my childhood stories of playing with dolls. Or here are my HRT medication pills. However, when we draw back from state philosophy and draw back outside of all cultural historical contingencies and outside of the societal context which produced the territory of trans women in the first place, aka when we look at the situation objectively, in actual reality, in truth, all of these requirements to fit into the category reveal themselves to be arbitrary. And thusly, the arbitrary nature of the category and the artificial nature of the territory is revealed. And if we take into account the multiplicity of actually existing human beings who identify themselves to be trans women, the category really starts to fall apart. Because it doesn't include all of those people. And I was under the impression that inclusion was our goal all along. So, if we were going to build a conception of gender that is actually accurate, we're going to need a category of trans woman, for example, that includes everyone who identifies as a trans woman. Which means we need to pose the question, what unites all of us, besides medications or childhood stories of early signs or features of our appearances? Well, it's the feminine essence from which all these secondary things flow, of course. Now, don't be alarmed by this. I'm not proposing an essentialist theory of gender but woke, and I'm not drifting into philosophical idealism either. I'm simply drawing on Deleuze's reading of Nietzsche. In Deleuze's book on Nietzsche and Philosophy, he explains that in order to understand the sense of a thing, be it a person, an object, even something in the natural world, or what have you, we need to understand the force which comes over the thing. Further in the book, he posits that there are some forces which are only capable of oppressing some things. A force is not always compatible with the thing that it's possessing, because forces have varying degrees of affinity with things that they possess. In the case of the trans feminine subject, that force would be, of course, the masculine identity which had been imposed upon her from birth. On the contrary, Deleuze says that the force which produces the most affinity between the thing that it possesses and the force itself becomes the essence of the thing, not just its sense. So when a force comes over something, and that thing finds more affinity with that force than with any other force, the force gives that thing not only its sense, but its essence. In the case of the trans feminine subject, of course, this would be her feminine identity. This component of one's essence is the same thing that I refer to as the gender identity component of one's gender, which is probably a phrase that you've heard me say already if you watch my videos. If so, then you've definitely heard me say that the gender identity component of a given person's gender is the sole determinant factor of which gender that person is. I'm not saying that someone saying out loud that they identify as a woman makes them a woman, as that's just an action which may indicate a feminine identity and not a sense which defines it. I'm saying that identifying as a woman itself makes one a woman. This is also an anti-essentialist theory of essences, funnily enough, even though it's metaphysical. I'm not saying that the essence is predetermined in some ideal spiritual realm and that trans people are born this way or born in the wrong bodies. Quite the contrary. I'm saying that the essence is formed by the struggle of forces throughout life. Natalie likes to talk about how she doesn't have a theology of gender identity. So it's good that I've found a way of explaining gender essences without drifting off into theology. Instead, this is a metaphysics of gender identity, or a philosophy of gender identity. But we could achieve roughly the same realization from a different philosophical angle that completely precludes the metaphysical, if you so prefer. Jean-Paul Sartre, who is this type of anti-metaphysical thinker, theorized that there's no external agent which controls human consciousness, and that human consciousness is a defining feature of a freedom which is constitutive of the human being. Sartre's existentialist thesis, existence precedes essence, is a claim that there is no predetermined essence or meaning to one's existence as a human being. We are thrown into the world first, with no predeterminations of anything before we are born. And then it is what we do in the world that creates our essence. For Sartre, there's a sliminess to reality. There is no fixed reality. Everything that makes up our social world in particular is just a result of human choices. Because what each individual is at the level of essences is a result of free human choices. So everything could be different, everything is conditional, and everything is subject to change. Now, Sartre does also have theories of how his radically free conception of subjectivity can be captured by the structures that already exist in the world as we are thrown into it. He calls these social exigencies, which obscure the conditional nature of things by imposing essences upon our lives, making for a simulation of fixedness that we fall into. Living one's life according to these social exigencies, and therefore squandering one's own agency and free choice, is what Sartre called bad faith. The key example of a social exigency is a job, like a waiter or a store clerk. Roles which have structurally enforced demands, yet are naturalized and often experienced as simply the way things are. Aided in this process by elements as simple as the alarm clock that wakes up the worker in time for their shift. If they didn't have the shift at that time, they most likely wouldn't wake up when they did. They would be able to spend their day in a way that they themselves chose. But this potentiality is obscured to them by the way that things are set up in the world that they were thrown into as a newborn individual, and all of the conditions and choices, both bad faith and good faith, which led them to that specific position in that time of their life. The point I would like to drive home here is that genders can also operate as social exigencies. Particularly all of the many gendered expectations which are enforced upon us as individuals by the constructs of gender as our social world has conceived of it today. One can go through life living in bad faith, conforming to all of these expectations, even if they don't truly want to. And everyone who conforms to gendered expectations automatically, without thinking, as if they are simply features of the natural world with some ideal predetermined essence of male and female, are acting in bad faith, even if they aren't trans. Let's say you have an individual who wants nothing more in the world than to put on a full face of makeup and a dress, but goes around barefaced and in shorts and a t-shirt because that is what the social exigency of man that they have been placed into, that has been imposed and inscribed upon their body by the social world outside of their own choice, an invasion from outside of their own consciousness, an experience of reality by institutions, demands. Once this individual pursues their genuine desire, they are making what constitutes a free and good faith choice, changing the world from then on, offering a small addition to the counterweight against gender as it is culturally enforced, and accessing what Sartre called true freedom. The realization that everything is conditional and everything can go another way if we just choose. Because it's a free and conscious choice, free movement of human consciousness, this is how, for Sartre, the trans feminine subject creates her own female essence. This isn't exclusive towards trans people who are closeted at all either. Because by extension, even that feeling that something is wrong as one conforms to the demands of the male gender which have been placed upon them is an action. Even the unconscious choice is a movement of consciousness, and therefore the production of oneself. Whichever way you slice it, whether you want to avoid the metaphysical or not, it is processes internal to the trans individual themselves which give them their female for trans women or male for trans men essences, or even xenogender essences or combinations for non-binary people, which make them the gender that they are. Not at the level of biological neurochemical psychology, as that understanding of the psyche lends itself to the lack of political understanding of mental health, and a lack of understanding of anything social, really, as that just sort of isolates reality into one's own mind. But at the level of phenomenological experience of the world and consciousness. Being transgender has nothing to do with your brain and everything to do with your life in the social. At the same time, it is not recognition by the current social context that the trans person is in that validates or makes them the gender that they are. It is not the way others treat you that make you who you were before anyone even treated you in any given way at all. It's the thing within yourself that defines you. In many ways, the social context of our society at large is actually the enemy in this regard. It's the thing to diverge from. It's the arbiter of the social exigencies. It will capture you and imprison you in your own skin. Therefore, that's the thing that we have to change, which means never ceding the ground on a concept of gender. Because that's key territory in the battle for trans liberation. It's not cis people that have hurt me my entire life. It's the concept of gender as it is enforced and instantiated, as it was created in the world I was thrown into against my own will. And now that I'm here, now that we're all here, I think what we should do is change that world.